Hello everyone. Today, the air changed before the leaves fell. There was something in the wind, sharper, quieter, like the world had drawn a long breath and was holding it. Out in the fields, where summer once rippled through the wheat, now there was only the slow crunch of frost creeping across the stubble. The animals grew restless first, then the children, then you. You were born to a village that doesn't have a name on any map. It's small. Mud-walled homes press close together like geese huddled in the dark. The roofs are low, thatched thickly with straw, the walls patched with wattle and daub that keep more memory than heat. Smoke trickles from the chimneys, not because it's cold yet, but because it will be. The elders always knew when the true cold was coming, not the early chills of autumn. Those were polite, almost nostalgic. No, this was the winter that took things. Breath, time, lives. And so the preparations began, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with silence. Quiet footsteps to the woods to gather what little dry kindling was left. Careful stacking of peat bricks. Fingers poking at the thatch to look for gaps where the wind might sneak through like a thief. You felt it first, at night. That strange thinness in the air, as though the warmth had been drained out of the world, leaving only the slow ache of absence. The bed was harder than usual. The hay. You curled up tighter, wrapped in every threadbare scrap of cloth that could pass for a blanket. Still, it wasn't enough. Your mother whispered something soft in the dark, a prayer or perhaps a promise. She always smelled of smoke and dried herbs, and in the cold her hands felt more like bone than flesh. She pressed them around yours and said, "We will outlast it." Not because she knew it for certain, but because sometimes saying it out loud was all you had. By morning, the frost clung to the inside of the shutters. The water pail near the door had a brittle skin of ice. The animals lowed and snorted, their breath curling like ghosts in the air. Your father was already up, already gone, chopping what wood he could from what trees still stood. The sun, if you could call that pale smear a sun, barely crept above the hills, and when it did, it gave no warmth, just a colorless light that made everything feel even colder. The wind moved in slow drafts through the gaps in the walls. It whispered against your ankles, then rose, curling up your spine like fingers. And still, life continued. It had to. There was no waiting out the cold. No shelters to flee to, no central hearth for the village. Each home was its own small fortress against the freeze, and your world shrank to the space between the hearthstone and the door. Venturing out was a kind of bravery, or desperation. But the cold, it wasn't just in the weather. It seeped into thoughts. It narrowed your vision, made everything feel slower, heavier. Even sound changed. Voices were softer, laughter rarer. The world became more about touch, about the heat of someone's back pressed against yours in sleep, the rough wool on your shoulders, the sting of your own breath on your fingers. Night came early, earlier than it should, and with it came a silence so complete you could hear the roof settling. You could hear the wind pulling at the edges of the thatch like a hungry hand. There were nights when the fire failed, and on those nights you learned what real cold was. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't romantic. It was teeth chattering, not because you were scared, but because your body was losing its grip. It was watching your siblings breathe in fits, curl tighter, try to disappear into themselves. It was huddling under everything you owned, and still feeling as though you were naked under the stars. You didn't sleep on those nights. You waited for the darkness to pass, for the first soft glow of ash in the fireplace, for the moment when someone, anyone, found a spark or a coal, and brought it back to life. Sometimes the cold would take the elderly first. You'd wake to silence, then hear the soft cry of someone discovering a body that hadn't stirred with the dawn. There were no dramatics, just grief folded in quiet rituals. A blanket pulled gently over the face, a candle lit, a soft chant. But somehow, the village always moved forward. You learned, over time, to listen for the signs. A sudden drop in the air pressure, a change in how the birds sounded, the way the animals grew still and huddled close without prompting. Instincts honed by generations of freezing nights passed down not in books, but in stories told by firelight. Don't leave your boots near the door. Don't let the last log burn all the way down. Don't sleep alone. You didn't ask why, you just did what you were told. There was something sacred about surviving winter, something ancestral, because if you could make it through the worst of it, if your fingers still moved, if your breath still came in steady clouds, then you were part of a chain that stretched back centuries. You belonged, even the animals felt it. They weren't just livestock in the cold, they were companions, sources of warmth. Sometimes the goats would be brought into the house. Their musk was sharp, but their bodies were warm, and in the darkest nights, that mattered more than smell. And always, the fire was the center of everything. It was never roaring, never grand, just a steady burn, a pulse, a heartbeat. Someone was always assigned to feed it, to watch it, to speak to it softly as if it might understand. Because if the fire went out, really went out, it wasn't just heat you lost, it was hope. Still, there were moments of strange beauty. The stars were clearer in winter, sharp, cold diamonds stitched across the sky, and the moon, full and white, would cast shadows that looked like ghosts walking the fields. The snow glowed in the light, even when your bones ached, and there were nights when someone would hum a tune, not loud, not for entertainment, just softly, a rhythm to carry you through the hours. Songs about warmer seasons, or saints who kept travelers warm, or lovers who waited through winters for their return. Sometimes you wondered what it would be like to live in a world without cold, a place where you didn't need to wrap your soul in cloth and prayer to make it through the night. But maybe, just maybe, the cold taught you something about endurance, about patience, about the quiet dignity of those who kept going, even when the world itself seemed to freeze. The village didn't talk much about survival, it just did it, day after day, frost after frost, and somehow morning always came, even if it took its time. You didn't build your house. It was built by hands that knew cold better than they knew comfort. It stood there before you were born, and likely will stand long after, not because it was strong, but because it was stubborn, like you. Your home wasn't grand. It didn't gleam in the morning sun or smell like polished wood. It smelled like earth, smoke, damp, straw, and living a mixture as old as memory. But every part of it, from the creaky timber to the moss-filled corners, was chosen with one mission in mind: to hold the cold at bay. It wasn't enough, but it tried. The walls were made from wattle and daub, thin wooden slats, woven like an old basket, covered in a thick paste of clay, dung, and straw. That mixture didn't insulate the way we think of insulation today, but it sealed cracks, stopped wind, and trapped warmth just long enough for you to feel it. Sometimes the daub cracked. That's when the real trouble began. Cold didn't need a door. It slipped in like smoke through any opening between slats, through roof seams, even under your fingernails if you stood still too long. You'd wake to find a fine dusting of frost on the inside of the wall. Your breath would rise in visible puffs, curling like slow fog around the rafters. The roof, the roof. It was your only real line of defense, thatched thick with layers of straw or reeds, sometimes packed with animal hair or moss. It wasn't waterproof, not fully, but it tried. You could lie awake at night listening to the wind whistle above and pray it wouldn't pull a piece loose. When it did, your dreams ended in drips. You patched holes with whatever you had. Old tunics, scraps of cloth soaked in animal fat, bark, straw, wadded tight and jammed into place with a prayer. It wasn't elegant, but in the deep cold, nothing was. Elegance didn't matter. Only survival did, and under your feet, the floor was dirt, hard-packed, cold as iron, unforgiving. You laid rushes or straw to soften the bite, but no amount of layering could stop the chill from rising. That's why every night, your bed was built not just up from the ground, but near the hearth, always near the hearth. Some homes had a central hearthstone, sunk into the floor, ringed with stones blackened by generations of smoke. Others had a fire bowl, a metal basin, on legs that stood in the middle of the room, its coals glowing like a quiet sun. There was no chimney. The smoke curled up and out through a hole in the roof. If it left at all, that meant the walls were blackened. Your lungs too. But in winter, the warmth was worth the coughing. There were no separate rooms, no insulation, no privacy. Every breath, every movement was shared. You knew the shape of your father's snore, the creak of your sister's joints, the sound your mother made when she shifted in her sleep. You knew when the fire was about to go out by the change in silence, that awful pause where everything waited. During the coldest months, sometimes the animals came inside, not by choice, not for company, for warmth. A cow's breath is warmer than most blankets. A goat's body pressed against yours in sleep was a comfort no bed could match. You learned to live with the smell. You had to. Some peasants built lean-tos against the sides of their homes, not for storage, but to block the wind. Anything to reduce the exposure. Some dug shallow cellars, where cold became less biting, more ... contained. Others simply wrapped themselves in cloaks so often patched, they no longer remembered the original color. Windows. If your home had them, they were small slits. No glass, of course, just oiled cloth or stretched animal bladder, translucent enough to let in grey light. But when the wind howled, even those were shuttered with wood or stuffed with straw. The cold made you creative. A broken cart became wall support. A cracked bucket, a chimney patch, an old tunic, a draft stopper. Nothing was waste. Everything was warmth. Every winter taught you something new about your home. How it moaned when the frost settled in. How it expanded and cracked as the temperature changed. You came to know your shelter like you knew your own hands. Flawed, work-worn, but familiar. And still, the cold found its way in. It would slip across the floor like mist. You could almost see it sometimes, the way the candle flame flickered without a breeze. The way your toes tingled inside thick wool socks. The way your lips stuck together in the morning. To survive, you changed how you moved. You slept in a ball. You sat with your knees tucked to your chest. You only undressed when absolutely necessary, and even then, quickly, shivering, hoping no draft found its way to your bare skin. Some peasants built sleeping platforms above the hearth, raised wooden planks with just enough room to lie curled. The heat rose, after all, and in a one-room house, a foot of altitude could mean the difference between dreams and frostbite. Still, you weren't always inside. You had to go out to fetch water, to gather fuel, to tend animals. And when you returned, the house greeted you like an old friend, imperfect, cold in its corners, but loyal in its attempt to shield you. At night, the fire glowed and shadows danced on the walls. The smoke hung low, your eyes stung, but you were grateful. Because even a choking, smoky warmth was better than none. Some families even built indoor tents, rope strung from one beam to another, holding up cloth around the bed, trapping body heat like a cocoon. You'd slip inside, close the flap, and pretend you were safe. In some villages, people plastered the interior walls with a second layer of daub just before winter, when the first chill came. That extra inch could trap enough heat to keep a family from freezing. It wasn't science. It was desperation, passed down as wisdom. There were no guarantees. You knew stories of homes collapsing under snow, of fires spreading too far, of children who wandered out into the dark and didn't come back. The cold didn't care how well you'd built your walls. It waited, it pressed, it seeped in, but you didn't give up. Every patch, every repair, every tightened strap or stuffed cloth was a small act of defiance. A way of saying, I am still here. I still breathe. You will not take me tonight. And when spring came, slowly, quietly, like a hesitant guest, you would go outside, stretch your aching limbs, and look back at the house that had held you through the storm. It would be sagging, damp, a little broken. So were you. But it had worked. And next year, you'd make it even stronger. Because in a world without insulation, without stone walls or glass, your shelter wasn't just a building. It was a memory of hands that patched, of breath that steamed, of lives that survived, of warmth, not as luxury, but as resistance. You never owned enough clothes. That was a truth you carried with you, like the ache in your back or the roughness in your hands. What you wore in the coldest months of the year wasn't tailored or planned. It was layered out of desperation, out of memory, out of whatever you could scavenge, borrow, or stitch together in time. Winter didn't wait for you to prepare, so you started early. As soon as the leaves began to brown, you opened the chest beneath your bed, if your family was lucky enough to have one, and pulled out what remained of last year's winter wear. Often it was damp, stiff, and smelling faintly of mold. You laid it near the hearth, gently, hoping the warmth would bring it back to life. Every piece of clothing you had bore the marks of the seasons that came before. Patches over patches, sleeves too short, buttons lost and replaced with string. Nothing matched, nothing was new, but it had to do. You started with the innermost layer, usually a coarse linen shirt, long and loose, that had once been white, but now held the color of old parchment. Over that came another shirt, sometimes wool if you were lucky, though wool wasn't always a guarantee. Wool was precious, and it scratched the skin in ways you could never forget. Then the tunic, heavier, darker, stained by labor and smoke. You tightened it with a simple belt, not for fashion, but to trap what little body heat your frame could muster. Around your legs, you wrapped hose, tight-fitting tubes of cloth tied at the thigh if you had them. If not, it was more linen, more layering, more hope. Feet were the hardest. No matter how many rags you wrapped, they still went numb. Wool socks, if you owned them, were hoarded like treasure. Most days, it was 2 or 3 layers of cloth, bound with string, tucked into boots that weren't really boots at all, more like stitched-together shoes of leather or hide, worn so thin you could feel the shape of each stone beneath your toes. You could always feel the cold coming through your feet first. Gloves, not unless someone loved you very much. Hands were left bare, or wrapped in cloth, or shoved into sleeves until you needed them. You blew on them constantly, and when that stopped working, you clenched them under your arms, trying not to think about the numbness creeping in like fog. Scarves were a luxury, hoods more common. Many peasants wore cowls, long hooded garments that draped over the shoulders. They didn't keep out all the cold, but they broke the wind, and in winter that felt like a miracle. Sometimes you stuffed straw into the folds of your clothing. It itched like sin, but it created space. Trapped air, and air even cold, was better than no barrier at all. Your breath formed clouds in front of your face as you walked, and your cheeks, always red, always raw. There were days when the wind was so bitter, you wrapped cloth around your mouth and nose until you could barely breathe. You looked more like a bandit than a farmer, trudging across the field like a ghost. But the alternative was frostbite. In truth, every article of clothing you wore was part armor, part memory. You remembered where each patch came from, the shirt your mother handed down, the cloak your older brother outgrew, the wool scrap given by a neighbor after your last one caught fire. Every piece told a story, not of style, but of survival. Washing clothes in winter was nearly impossible. Water froze too quickly, so the garments grew stiff with smoke, sweat, and the grime of labor. They smelled of your life and your fear, but they kept you warm, and that was all you could ask. You rarely removed them. Bathing was rare too. In winter it was dangerous. Stripping down, even indoors, was enough to send chills into your very bones. So you layered and kept layering and learned to live with the weight. That weight became part of you. You moved more slowly, more heavily. Bending down took effort. Standing up required balance. Your shoulders ached from the layers. But your skin was hidden, and in winter, hiding from the cold was the best you could do. Children suffered most. Their clothes were hand-me-downs of hand-me-downs. They wore adult garments cut down or folded awkwardly to fit. Their sleeves dangled past their hands. Their boots flopped. But they ran anyway, because running even in the cold was warmth. And the elderly, they bore the cold like a memory. They sat nearest the fire, their bones too brittle to handle drafts. They wore every layer they owned, all at once. You could tell they were cold, not by complaint, they never complained, but by the way they sat, folded into themselves, eyes distant, breath shallow. Sometimes the warmth wasn't enough, and you saw that in their stillness. You tried not to think about it, because there was no room for fear when dressing for the cold. There was only action. You wrapped, you tied, you tucked. Every morning, every evening, even in sleep, you kept layers on. And if you were lucky, someone curled against your back, and their warmth, small as it was, became the difference between night and death. Still, you dreamt of warmth, not the kind you fought for, but the kind that came easily. A bath, a blanket, a sunlit room. You'd never known those things, but you imagined them sometimes, and in the imagining there was comfort. Some families had tricks, clay pots heated by the fire, wrapped in cloth, placed under the covers. Stones warmed and tucked at the foot of the bed. These were secrets passed down like heirlooms, not worth money, but worth everything. Others rubbed lard or fat into the soles of their feet. It helped, they said, to seal in warmth. You didn't question it, you just did it. You envied the nobility, not for their castles or their food, but for their fur-lined cloaks. Fur was rare in the village. If you had it, it was ragged, short-haired, and often moth-eaten. Still, you treasured it. You wore it on your chest, over your heart, because you wanted the warmth close to your soul. Some nights, when the wind roared and the door rattled on its hinges, you held your own arms tightly and whispered, "Just until spring," because spring was the promise, the slow shedding of layers, the chance to feel sun on your neck again. But until then, you dressed like the earth dressed itself, in thick cover, in silence, in stillness. And every thread, every knot, every tucked fold was part of your resistance, not to fashion, but to forgetting what it means to be warm. You didn't worship the fire, not in the way the priest spoke of saints or relics, but you honored it, respected it, relied on it in a way that went beyond reason. Because in the long dark of medieval winter, when the wind howled like a creature from forgotten myths and the cold curled into your very bones, the fire wasn't just a tool, it was your lifeline. It began each morning before the light. You or someone in your family, often the one who'd slept closest to the hearth, would rise from sleep and kneel before the ash, whispering small hopes into the embers. You'd prod gently, hoping for the telltale red glow beneath the grey. If there was none, your breath caught. No ember meant no warmth, no fire, no cooking, no safety. Starting from scratch was never easy. Flints were precious, tinder even more so. You learned to save every scrap, dry moss, old cloth, bark, shaved, paper thin, anything that could take a spark. You blew, gently, coaxing flame from nothing, your lips chapped and trembling, praying that the spark would catch. When it did, you felt it, not just the heat, but the relief, as though the world had tilted slightly back into balance. You fed the fire, slowly at first, small twigs, bits of straw, a careful build, like wooing a shy animal. Too fast, and you smothered it. Too slow, and it died. You learned the rhythm: feed, wait, breathe, feed again. Once it took, the whole house changed. The smoke rose first, filling the room in soft swirls before slipping through the smoke hole above. Your eyes watered. You coughed, but that meant it was working. The warmth came next, slow and creeping. You held your hands close, turned them, pressed them to your cheeks. The fire's warmth wasn't even filled the room. It radiated in a shrinking circle, strongest near the hearth, fading with every footstep away. That's why the whole family stayed close, cooking, mending, even sleeping. There were no proper stoves, no ovens. Cooking happened over the open flame, or in pots nestled in the coals. You learned to stir with patience, to shift logs with skill. The wrong move sent sparks flying, or worse, sent the pot tumbling, spilling precious food you couldn't afford to lose. Wood was valuable, to maybe the most valuable thing after food. Gathering it in the months before winter was a task that defined the seasons. You hauled branches, chopped logs, dried twigs. You stored them under lintews, in corners, even stacked inside the house when space allowed. But it was never enough. No matter how much you gathered, you burned through it faster than you could believe. On the coldest nights, you rationed it, a few small sticks every hour, just enough to keep the flame alive. Peat was used to when wood was scarce. Thick, damp bricks cut from the earth, dried in stacks over the summer. It smelled different when it burned, more earthy, more acrid, but it burned long and slow, and that made all the difference. Sometimes you turned to dung. You didn't speak of it much. It wasn't polite, even then. But dried animal dung burned hot, and if it was a choice between pride and survival, survival always won. The fire was where life happened. You gathered there, in a circle of flickering light, telling stories or sharing silence. Children played at its edge, watched carefully. The elderly sat nearest, often staring into the flames, like they saw something others didn't. Maybe memory, maybe ghosts. You learned to read the fire like a friend, the way it cracked when the wood was dry. The hiss of moisture, the sharp snap that meant trouble. You watched the flames color yellow, and clean meant good air. Blue meant it was hungry. Smoky meant trouble in the flue or a damp log. The hearth was also the home's altar, not in any official sense, but in the way people treated it, with reverence. You'd leave offerings there sometimes, a pinch of flour, a sprig of herb, a whisper. Not because you believed the fire was a god, but because you knew it could take your life if you angered it. And then, there were the nights when it failed, when the last log crumbled too early, when the ember winked out, when the wind outside howled so fiercely it sucked the life from the coals. You felt the cold crawl back in like an old enemy. Your breath became visible again. Your fingers stiffened. The shadows grew deeper, closer, heavier. The house, once golden with light, turned grey and silent. You wrapped yourselves tighter, drew closer, tried to remember the shape of heat. Some families kept a living coal, a special ember from a sacred fire, sometimes carried from a neighbour's hearth in a sealed clay pot if their own fire died. That ember, once relit, was treated like a treasure. It could save a family from freezing. Others used fire irons, long rods heated until they glowed, then used to reignite damp logs. Dangerous, but effective, if you knew what you were doing. But every family feared the deep freeze, because no matter how strong your will, without fire, your body surrendered. Slowly, quietly, first the numbness, then the shivering, then the stillness. That's why someone always stayed awake. Each night you took turns feeding the flame. You sat in silence, poking gently, turning logs, watching the light dance across the walls. It wasn't glamorous, it was lonely, but it was vital. The fire didn't just warm your skin, it held back despair. Without it, the night stretched too long, the dark became too deep, the silence too loud, and even in dreams you felt its absence. But when it held, when it lasted the night, there was peace. You'd wake to its glow, weak but alive. The house smelled of ash and warmth. You could feel your toes. The walls, though still cold, felt less oppressive. You'd add more fuel, gently, whispering thanks you didn't say out loud. And the fire, faithful as breath, would rise again. In that simple act, feeding flame, there was hope. A promise that spring would come. Eventually, not because you didn't want to, though loneliness was its own kind of cold, but because solitude was dangerous in winter. Alone, your body lost heat fast. Together, even wrapped in thin cloth and silence, people became each other's fire. The shared bed wasn't wide or soft or clean. It was a wooden frame if you were lucky, planks if you weren't, laid with straw and covered in wool or linen, sometimes with a few animal skins thrown across the top. The bedding was never thick enough. It flattened after a few nights. It grew damp after a few weeks. It carried the scent of people trying not to freeze, but it was shared. Children slept on either side of their parents, curled in small, perfect balls. Older siblings lay shoulder to shoulder, hips touching, breaths mingling in a cloud above them. Grandparents, frail and brittle, were placed closest to the wall, away from the draft. You, somewhere in the middle, always touched someone. You learned to sleep like a knot, arms pulled in, legs bent, chin down. Your body curved into itself, into others, like ivy reaching for heat. Some nights there were 6 or more in the bed. No one turned, no one stretched. To move was to lose heat, and so you stayed as still as possible. Your body became a border, and through that border passed everything: warmth, dreams, the slow rhythms of breath. The shared bed wasn't a place of conversation. Words in the dark meant wasted heat. You whispered if you had to, but mostly you slept in the company of quiet bodies and the sounds of the night, the wind at the shutters, the creak of the beams, the occasional murmur of someone caught in a dream. You listened to their breathing. That was the fire now, not the hearth, but lungs drawing air and pushing it back again and again. Proof that the night hadn't claimed anyone yet. And sometimes the animals joined you. A dog at your feet, a cat curled on your stomach. If you were lucky or desperate, a goat or small pig nestled close, wrapped in straw, warm and surprisingly calm. You stopped thinking of them as animals. They were warmth, and that was enough. Blankets weren't generous. 1 or 2 per family. Wool, if you had it. More often, patched linen stuffed with straw or down. The filling shifted. The corners frayed, but it covered just enough. You tucked it tight beneath your knees, pulled it high beneath your chin. You breathed into the cloth, warming it with every exhale, turning it damp but tolerable. On the coldest nights, someone would rise to stoke the fire. You barely stirred, only shifted slightly as the warmth returned. Maybe the blanket slipped. Maybe a draft found your toes. But you didn't complain. You couldn't. You knew what real cold was. And this, with bodies near and heat shared, wasn't it? Privacy didn't exist. You heard every sound, felt every twitch. You smelled each other, the sourness of unwashed bodies, the smoke in hair, the closeness of breath. It wasn't pleasant, but it was human. And in the dark, being human was better than being cold. Sometimes people whispered stories. Not fairy tales, those came in warmer months, when minds wandered freely. These were simpler stories. A neighbor's kindness, a memory of last year's snowfall, a dream of bread, told softly from one bedmate to another, like passing a coal between cupped hands. The stories didn't entertain, they tethered. They reminded you that others had lived through this, that your suffering wasn't solitary, that warmth wasn't always a flame. Sometimes it was a voice. And then there were nights when someone didn't sleep. They lay awake, trembling, sweating beneath the blankets, burning with fever. You felt it in their skin, in the strange heat that made your own body flinch. You stayed close anyway, because distance was colder than sickness, and sometimes even fevers passed. Not always, but sometimes, and hope, like warmth, came in layers. The mornings were hardest. Leaving the shared bed felt like betrayal. The moment you lifted the covers, the cold slapped you hard. You moved quickly, boots on, layers wrapped, hands tucked. You didn't look back. If you did, you'd hesitate. But the fire needed tending. The animals needed feeding. And the others still sleeping. They'd do their part when it was their turn. You all took turns, because survival wasn't solitary. It was cooperative, intimate, wordless. Sometimes you huddled even during the day. If the cold was cruel, you pulled blankets round shoulders, gathered near the hearth, and sat, backs pressed, knees touching, heads nodding slowly in unison. You didn't talk. There was nothing new to say, but you were together. Togetherness became warmth, not in metaphor, in fact, in measurable, physical degrees of heat. You could feel it. If someone left the room, You noticed the drop. The air shifted. The edge crept closer. You waited for them to return, even if they had no more heat than you. Their presence was insulation. Their body was part of the system. And when guests came, they joined the bed. Neighbors displaced by storm, strangers caught in snow. They were given space, however narrow. You didn't ask names. You didn't need gratitude. You needed heat, and they brought it. You'd wake tangled in unfamiliar limbs, unfamiliar smells, but you were all warm, and that was what mattered. It wasn't just survival. It was tenderness, shaped by necessity. The cold demanded intimacy, and you gave it, not romantically, not by choice, but by instinct. You shared because sharing saved you. Even grief had to be shared. If someone didn't wake, the blanket stayed over their face. You mourned in silence, in closeness. You didn't move them until the fire was strong, until you could step into the cold without shaking. Then you made space. The bed felt colder for days. You didn't say it, but everyone knew. Someone was missing from the fire you'd built with your bodies. But the others, the living, still breathed, still curled, still whispered, and the warmth returned. Eventually, because people are like embers. If you huddle them close, feed them gently, protect them from the wind, they survive. You didn't eat for pleasure in winter. You ate to keep going. In the coldest months, food wasn't flavor or celebration. It was heat. It was the slow release of strength into your limbs. It was the dull ache of hunger turned down just enough to let you sleep. You didn't ask what was in the pot. You asked if there was enough. The day began with porridge. Always porridge. Oats, if you were lucky. Barley more often. Sometimes rye. Thick, boiled with water or watered milk. Salted if you had it. Sweetness was a luxury. Maybe a bit of honey from the summer if it had lasted. Maybe a chopped, dried apple. But more often it was grey and plain, and it clung to your ribs like damp wool. But it was warm. You held the bowl in your hands just to feel the heat. You breathed in the steam and let it fill your nostrils before the first bite. The warmth travelled down your throat and settled in your belly like a sleeping cat. You didn't finish quickly. Not because you were savouring, but because you wanted it to last. The pot sat near the fire all day, and anything that could go in, went in. Leftover porridge was reheated. Bread scraps, if they were too hard to chew, were boiled down. Bones, with the marrow long since sucked dry, might be thrown in for flavour, or at least for the comfort of ritual. The midday meal wasn't separate. It was more porridge, or a stew if there'd been a slaughter recently, or if a neighbour had brought something to share. Stews were your salvation. You learned the rhythm of the pot, the slow bubble, the drift of smells that filled the small home and masked the scent of bodies, animals, damp walls. Carrots, if they'd lasted, turnips, onion. Sometimes bits of dried meat, cut so fine you had to look to find them. But they were there, and that was enough. The pot stayed on the fire all day, added to, stirred, never fully emptied. Everyone ate from it, sometimes from shared bowls, sometimes with wooden spoons passed hand to hand. Cleanliness wasn't the point. Warmth was. Dinner was the same. The last ladles of stew, thickened by everything that had come before, were shared in silence. No one complained. Even if the carrots were mush, even if the water tasted faintly of smoke, because it was hot, and hot meant survival. Cold food was for summer. In winter, your mouth needed steam. Your belly needed heat. Even the smallest warmth made the house feel gentler, the night less cruel. There were rituals, too. Bread, hard as wood, was soaked in broth, Ale was warmed, weak ale, barely stronger than water, but boiled, it comforted. On rare nights, someone pulled out a cloth-wrapped wheel of cheese. You cut it with reverence, shared it like a blessing. You chewed slowly, not for manners, but because you didn't know when you'd feel that satisfaction again. There were no snacks, no treats, no indulgences. Children were taught early, food is for function. Sugar was unheard of. Fruit, dried and shriveled, was a treasure hidden until the solstice or the feast of a saint. Meat, real meat, was rare. When it came, it was cause for quiet gratitude. Salted pork, smoked fish, a small joint of mutton. You didn't eat until full. You ate until not empty, and that was a gift. Sometimes food came from others. A neighbor, knowing your stores were low, left a bundle at your door. You did the same when you could. Because starvation in winter wasn't noble, it was stupid, and shared calories kept the village alive. The hearth was kitchen and altar. You stirred in turns. The ladle passed from hand to hand, each person watching the pot like it held answers. In a way, it did. The state of the stew told you everything. How much was left, how long you might last, how well the house was holding. The children helped, too. They peeled what vegetables remained. They ground grain with stones, slowly, carefully. They watched, always watched, because the fire could flare and ruin the pot, or die and leave you with nothing but cold broth. In winter, food wasn't guaranteed. Stores ran low. The root cellar offered only shriveled potatoes, softening onions. The dried beans took longer to cook, longer to chew. The barrels of ale grew lighter. The cheese grew mold. You scraped the mold off. You boiled the beans longer. You ate the food anyway. Because it wasn't about taste. It was about warmth. Even celebration was about warmth. On holy days, you might have an egg, an extra hunk of bread, a bit of butter saved for the occasion. Not because it was expected, but because small joy warmed as much as stew. You taught the children to be grateful. Not with sermons, but with silence. You handed them a bowl and watched them eat, and if they licked the spoon, you smiled, because hunger was loud, and a quiet child was a fed one. Some families fasted, not for religion, but necessity. You drank more broth. You added more water to the pot. You went to bed early, hoping sleep would quiet the belly. But even hunger had a rhythm. You learned to live with it. You learned to sleep with it. Because as long as there was something in the pot, as long as the fire burned and the ladle stirred, you were not done. The stew was a story of seasons, of labor, of survival. It changed color, texture, smell, but it remained, and in that pot, always bubbling, always giving, was the soft promise of warmth. Not abundance, just enough, and enough was a feast. It didn't care if your hands bled, if your back ached, or if the wind stole the breath straight from your lungs. Winter was indifferent, and the work, the endless, necessary work, didn't pause just because the world had frozen over. You woke in the dark, not metaphorically, literally. The sun had not yet risen, and would not rise for hours. The house was quiet, except for the creak of wood adjusting to cold, the slow breath of those still sleeping beside you. You slipped from the warmth of bodies and blankets, and felt the air strike your skin like a slap. Layer after layer of clothing, each colder than the last, went on with hands already numbed. Boots were stiff with yesterday's frost. Laces had to be thawed near the hearth before they would bend. You didn't speak. Speaking meant breath, and breath meant heat lost. Outside, The ground was iron. Even the mud had frozen into stone. The path to the barn was slick, treacherous, a slide of ice beneath dustings of snow. You walked carefully, shoulders hunched, every muscle braced. One fall could mean a broken limb, and a broken limb in winter was as good as a death sentence. The animals greeted you with soft noises, clouds of steam rising from their nostrils. They were hungry, always hungry. Their water had frozen in its trough, and the hay was running low. You worked fast, fingers stiff, fumbling with frozen ropes and icy latches. Your breath came in bursts, sharp and visible, like pieces of your soul escaping into the cold. Milking a cow with frozen hands was its own kind of torment. The udders were warm, one of the few warm things in the world, but your hands couldn't feel them properly. You had to trust the rhythm, listen to the sound of milk hitting the pail, hope your fingers remembered what numbness made them forget. Outside again, wood had to be chopped. Always more wood. The pile never seemed high enough, never secure. The axe was heavy, the handle smooth with wear. The wood split with a sound that felt satisfying, sharp, almost violent, a reminder that something could still be broken, even in a world frozen solid. You stacked the logs neatly, watching your breath hang in the air. You didn't linger. Lingering meant cold settling into your bones, a stillness that could become something worse. And then the fields. Even in winter there was work. Ditches had to be cleared, fences repaired, traps checked, nets mended, grain sorted, tools sharpened. You worked with gloves if you had them, rags if you didn't. Sometimes you used your bare hands, knowing they would split and crack, but needing the precision no cloth could offer. Your fingers bled. They always bled. The cracks opened like mouths, slow and red and sore. You wrapped them in strips of linen, covered in fat or resin if you could spare it. But the pain stayed. It lived in your joints, behind your knuckles, beneath your nails. And still you worked. Because no one else would do it for you. The cold didn't ask if you were ready. It demanded. The livestock needed tending. The tools needed fixing. The house needed defending from the slow invasion of snow and damp and rot. You chopped ice from the well each morning. A block of frozen silence, broken with an iron bar and hauled out piece by piece. Water was life and weight. You carried it back with shaking arms, trying not to slip, praying the pail wouldn't spill. You didn't eat until the work was done, not because of punishment, but because warmth came first. The fire needed feeding, the animals needed feeding, the chores needed finishing. And then, only then, could you take a bowl in your hands and sit near the hearth. Sometimes, the village called for work together, repairing a roof, digging out a collapsed wall, building a snow barrier to block the wind from someone's door. You joined because you had to, because one family's collapse could mean another's tomorrow. You didn't talk much, just moved, together, in rhythm. Breathing, lifting, hammering, sweating under layers of wall. Sweat was dangerous. You learned quickly too much effort, and the sweat froze against your skin. Your underclothes turned to ice, and then the cold crept in, deeper, sharper, unstoppable. You had to find the balance, work hard enough to survive, not so hard that survival turned against you. You paced yourself, not out of laziness, but out of necessity. Your body was your only tool. You protected it as best you could. You learned to move with efficiency, to rest only when safe, to never sit on cold stone, to never lean too long against snow-covered walls. You worked with others, often in silence, There was no need for words. Everyone knew what needed to be done. Everyone's fingers hurt. Everyone's lips cracked. The shared silence was its own language, one of endurance, of grim companionship. Children worked, too. They carried small bundles of sticks, led goats, fetched water. Their cheeks were red with cold, their noses running. But they smiled more easily than adults. They hadn't yet learned the weight of survival. Not fully. The elderly worked less. They stayed near the fire, mended clothes, told stories in murmured voices. Their hands, though gnarled and slow, still moved with purpose. They taught you how to stitch, how to wrap a foot against frost, how to recognize the smell of wood gone bad. Every task had meaning, every hour earned, because winter didn't offer second chances. One forgotten chore could mean sickness. One broken tool, a day lost. One spill, a sprain, an injury, and the whole family suffered. So you worked, even when your hands didn't feel like yours, even when the wind cut through your layers, even when your thoughts blurred with fatigue, because the cold didn't stop, and neither could you. They came early, sometimes before the animals had settled, before the last chores were done. The sun dipped behind the hills with quiet finality, and the world surrendered to darkness, not as an event, but as a condition of existence. By midwinter, daylight was a rumor. It flickered for a few brief hours and then was gone. Most of your hours were spent in the half-light of the fire or in near blackness, lit only by coals and the occasional oil lamp sputtering with a wick too short and oil too thin, and the silence that followed. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It pressed against the walls, slipped into your clothes, settled in your thoughts. You tried not to notice it. You busied your hands. You stirred the fire. You hummed. But it was there, watching, waiting. A silence so complete it seemed to echo. The wind outside never rested. It howled across the fields like a lost thing, slamming against shutters, pulling at the roof as if trying to lift it from the house altogether. And when it paused, when the wind suddenly fell still, that was worse, because then you heard everything: the crack of wood settling, the rustle of straw, the slow, persistent drip from somewhere unseen, the breath of someone sleeping fitfully, the scratch of a mouse in the corner. Every sound was louder in the dark. Every sound meant something might be wrong. You huddled close to the fire, not always because you were cold, though you usually were, but because it anchored you. Its flicker gave shape to the room, made the world a little less formless. Without it, the shadows would have swallowed everything. There were no distractions, no books to read, no clocks to watch, no music, not unless someone dared hum. Just the fire, the dark, and your thoughts. And in winter, thoughts turned inward. You remembered people who were no longer here, neighbors who hadn't survived the last winter, a sibling lost to fever, a parent buried beneath snow so thick it took until spring to mark the grave. You didn't speak their names aloud. It was too much, as if doing so would invite the cold to find you next. The church taught that long nights were times for reflection, for repentance, for prayer, and maybe they were, but more often they were times of dread, of wondering how many more days the food would last, how many more logs before the pile outside vanished. If that cough your sister had was just the cold or something worse, if the wind would take the roof, if your boots would hold one more walk to the well, if you would make it to spring. You didn't speak of these fears. They hung in the room like the smoke from the hearth, constant, bitter, inescapable. Everyone knew, no one needed to say it. Sleep came slowly. Your body was tired, but your mind was too full. You lay in the shared bed, surrounded by others, and stared into the black. Your thoughts circled like wolves, soft-footed, relentless. You tried to think of warmer times, of fields in bloom, of summer dust on your skin, but winter made even memories colder. You pulled the blanket higher, tucked your face beneath the cloth, breathed into it until the fabric grew damp and warm. You counted heartbeats. You listened for someone else's breath. You waited. Sometimes sleep came, sometimes it didn't. When it didn't, the night stretched endlessly. You turned slowly, careful not to wake the others. You recited prayers you didn't fully believe. You tried to remember every word of a song from your childhood. You imagined the feel of sun on your face. You imagined green, because in winter, green was a dream. The darkness played tricks. You thought you saw shapes in the corners, thought you heard voices beneath the wind. Sometimes you were sure someone had knocked at the door, though no one ever came at night. You told yourself it was your imagination. But the cold made everything seem more possible, more dangerous, more alive. Some believed the spirits were strongest in winter, that the long nights thinned the veil between worlds, that lost souls wandered the snow, that ancient things moved beneath the ice, waiting for a breath to follow, a door left unlatched. You didn't believe, not fully, but you made sure the latch was closed, just in case. You whispered to the fire, sometimes, not prayers, not words, even, just sound. Something to fill the silence, to say, I am still here. And maybe the fire answered. Maybe its crackle was more than wood and flame. Maybe it was listening to in the deepest hours, when even the animals were still. You sometimes felt something else. Not fear, not quite, but a strange quiet. A stillness so deep it felt sacred. The kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breath, your own presence. It didn't last, but in that moment you weren't thinking of the cold, or the food, or the roof. You were simply existing in the dark, in the quiet. And somehow that was enough. Morning always came, eventually, not with joy, not in winter, but with light, a pale grey smear across the sky. The kind of dawn that didn't warm, didn't glow, but still meant the night was over, that you'd survived another one. You moved slowly. You stirred the coals. You rubbed your arms. You checked the firewood. You counted the potatoes. You didn't smile, but you didn't cry either, because winter was long, and so were its nights. But they always ended, even the darkest ones, not out of naivety, but necessity. When the wind screamed like a beast outside your door, when frost crept silently into your bed, when food ran low and the fire guttered without reason, belief was not just comfort. It was protection, structure, an attempt to make sense of a world that didn't care if you lived through the night. Winter was the season of spirits. You didn't question it. You saw it in the eyes of the elders when the first frost came early, when the snow fell heavy and wet. They muttered blessings without being asked, crossed themselves at odd moments, hid small charms under the hearthstones. Not because they were foolish, but because they remembered. They had seen what the cold could do, and they knew that sometimes what killed a person wasn't the cold itself. It was the thing that came with it. The old stories were clear. There were spirits that travelled with the wind, pale figures with no faces, searching for warmth, for breath. Some said they were the dead, lost on the road to judgment. Others said they were something older, something born of snow and night, with hands like ice and hearts like absence. You didn't look outside after dark. If you heard something at the door, you didn't open it. Not in winter. Because sometimes the thing knocking didn't want shelter. It wanted you. Salt was scattered across thresholds. Rowan branches hung over windows. Bells tied with red thread were hidden in the rafters. You didn't speak of it openly. Superstition was frowned upon, but you did it anyway. Everyone did, because belief was a blanket, a barrier. There were stories of the Yule spirits, not the merry ones of feast and song, but the cold ones. Spirits of hunger, of regret, of lives cut short by frost. They were said to slip in through the smoke hole, to settle in the cold corners of the house, to whisper your name as you dreamed. Children were told not to whistle after sundown, not to speak the names of the dead at night, not to leave their shoes out in the open. You didn't always know why, you just obeyed. And in the morning, when the fire was still burning and no one had vanished into the snow, you felt gratitude without knowing for what. Even the church made room for winter fears. Masses were held not just for the living, but for the dead who might linger. Priests gave blessings over firewood, over salted meat, over shoes stitched for long journeys through snow. Holy water froze in its basin, but people still touched their fingers to it, because ritual warmed the mind, even if not the body. There were nights, long, cold, moonless nights, when someone would claim to have seen a figure standing at the edge of the woods, not moving, just watching, a tall shape, darker than the darkness, outlined against the snow. You'd whisper about it the next day, never loudly. You didn't joke about it. Laughter in winter could draw the wrong kind of attention. Dreams were different in the cold. You dreamed of fire that wouldn't light, of doors that wouldn't close, of thin voices calling you into the night. You woke sweating, even in the chill. You felt watched. You turned to the hearth and prayed that its glow would chase the memory away. Some said the cold itself had a spirit, not a god, exactly, not something to worship, but something aware, something hungry. You fed it in small ways, a piece of bread tossed into the snow, a whispered apology when wood snapped too sharply. Not because you expected reward, but because respect might keep you alive. Death was closer in winter. You smelled it in the air, not rot, but stillness. You saw it in the faces of the frail, in the hesitation before someone opened a door, in the way even the brave grew quiet when the wind shifted. And so you believed, because belief gave shape to fear. It allowed you to prepare, to act, to endure. Some homes kept small, carved figures, wood-shaped into strange, hunched forms, worn smooth by years of handling. They sat near the hearth, or were buried in the walls. You didn't ask where they came from. You didn't touch them unless you needed to. They weren't idols. They were memories of winters past, of promises made. When a child was sick, a charm was tied to their wrist. Red wool, ash, a drop of wax. Not medicine, not prayer, but both. When the fire burned too low, you sang to it. Not a song anyone would recognize, just sound. So it knew you were still watching. There were things you didn't say in winter. You didn't speak of how cold it really was. You didn't name your fears. You didn't tell someone they looked pale, not if they did, because naming it gave it power. And in the long night, power belonged to the cold. Still, belief wasn't always fear. There were good spirits, too. Ancestors who watched. Forest spirits who kept the wolves at bay. Creatures of the snow who helped the fire catch, who guarded lost travelers, who whispered to those who listened carefully. You left them gifts, bread, milk, dried herbs, just in case. Because winter didn't just take, sometimes it gave back. If you showed respect, if you followed the rules, if you believed enough to see it. And when spring came, when the snow began to melt and the days stretched longer, you didn't forget those beliefs. You just folded them away, like winter clothes. Put them in the corners of your mind, where they would wait, for the next long night, the next breath of frost on the wind, the next reason to remember why you still believed. You weren't born ready for winter. No child is. The cold doesn't make exceptions for age. It bites just as hard into small hands as it does into old bones. But childhood in the medieval cold was not a season of ignorance. It was a lesson, daily, harsh, unrelenting, in how to survive without complaint. You learned by watching. Before you could speak, you understood the ritual of layers, how to wrap your feet in cloth, how to pull your sleeves over your fingers, how to tighten the belt of your tunic to trap what little warmth you had. Your first memories weren't of summer flowers or games in green fields. They were of frost, of the sting in your nose as you stepped outside, of how the air made your teeth ache, of the weight of your mother's hand guiding you toward the fire, not with warmth, but with firmness. Stay close, she would say, not just because of the cold, but because getting lost in winter meant more than distance. It meant danger. You didn't have many toys. A wooden figure carved from firewood, a stuffed rag doll, maybe a ball stitched from scraps of hide. But your favorite pastime was sitting by the fire, your chin on your knees, watching the flames curl and snap. It wasn't entertainment. It was survival school. You learned the sound of a fire that needed feeding, the scent of wet wood, the timing of the kettle. You listened to the grown-ups speak softly about the weather, the food stores, the neighbors, and you remembered, not because they told you to, but because their worry was its own language, and you wanted to understand. You helped where you could, carrying water with both hands, sloshing over your boots, gathering kindling from the edge of the forest, never too far, holding the ends of cloth while someone mended it, stirring the pot slowly, carefully, because if you spilled, there was no second helping. The cold made your world small. The distance from the hearth to the door felt like a journey. From your bed to the barn, an expedition. You dreaded mornings, the shock of cold air on your face, the sting of pulling on frozen boots, the way your breath looked like it was trying to escape. School, if there was one, didn't happen in winter. There was work to be done. You were too young for the hardest labor, but not too young to feel tired. Your fingers went numb quickly. Your nose ran constantly. Your cheeks were chapped, red, and rough. You scratched without thinking. You were always told to stop. Don't break the skin, your grandmother warned. The cold will get in. You believed her, because in winter, everything could be dangerous, even a scratch. At night, you slept pressed between bodies. Your siblings, your parents, sometimes your cousins. You didn't mind the lack of space. The warmth was worth it. You curled your knees to your chest, found a patch of blanket, and buried your nose in someone's back. Their smell was familiar, sour, smoky, human, safe. You whispered questions in the dark. Will it snow again? Is the fire going to last? Will we still have bread tomorrow? Sometimes someone answered. More often, they just sighed. A soft sound that meant, we hope so. And that had to be enough. Illness came quickly. One day you had a cough. The next, you couldn't breathe. You watched others worry, not with panic, but with a quiet, sharp fear that sat behind their eyes. They wrapped you tighter. They gave you warm broth with a bit more fat. They placed their hands on your forehead and closed their eyes. You didn't ask what they were thinking. You were too tired, but you knew. Some children didn't wake up. You saw it. Not directly, but in the way their names were spoken in past tense, in the way a bed was left unmade for days, in the way your mother looked at you longer than usual and then turned away quickly. You didn't understand it fully, but you knew it was part of winter. Games still happened. You played in the snow when it was soft. You built shapes with your hands, chased chickens too slow to run. You laughed. Children always do, but the laughter didn't last long. The cold made sure of that. Your mittens were just rags, tied with string. They got wet fast. Your boots leaked. Your face burned with cold, and your hair, once damp, froze in stiff tendrils. But still, for those brief moments, joy broke through like a spark. You lived for those sparks. The way the snow glowed under moonlight, the sound of icicles cracking from the roof, the smell of soup when the pot was opened, the warmth of someone pulling you close, wrapping you in their cloak. You didn't think of comfort. You thought of moments, and the cold taught you to treasure them. You watched the adults closely. You saw how they endured, how they stood outside with their faces blank, chopping wood with red hands, how they smiled at you even when their lips were cracked, how they passed the last bit of food to the youngest without a word. And you learned that winter was not about suffering. It was about endurance, about kindness, the quiet, unspoken kind. When someone wrapped their scarf around your neck before their own, when a neighbor brought a small toy carved from scrap wood, when your mother let you sit closest to the fire, even though she was colder. You grew up fast, but not in a way that felt wrong. You grew up into the rhythm of survival, into the understanding that nothing was promised, but many things were possible if you stayed close, stayed warm, stayed kind. By the time you were 10, you knew more about cold than most people know in a lifetime. Not just the way it felt, but the way it shaped you, taught you how to wait, how to help, how to hope, and perhaps most importantly, how to hold on. You learned the sound of sickness before you understood what it meant. It was the cough that didn't stop, the kind that rattled in the chest like pebbles in a jug. It started quiet, dry, maybe once or twice in a day. But in winter, it always grew. It echoed at night. It kept people awake. It made others fall silent when they heard it, because they knew, in the cold, illness was not a visitor. It was a resident. The house itself became its home, dark, damp, poorly ventilated. The smoke from the fire, thick and bitter, irritated throats and eyes, but you couldn't let it die. Without it, sickness was faster. Without it, the air was colder, and the cold took everything it touched. No one knew what caused the illnesses exactly. Bad air, bad water, bad luck maybe, or spirits, as the elders sometimes said. Angry ones, ones drawn to breath in the dark. Either way, you feared it like a beast with no shape. The signs were always the same. A cough, then the fever, a heaviness in the limbs, a sudden stillness in someone who'd been moving just fine the day before. Their eyes got glassy, their voice faded, they stopped eating, stopped rising. And then came the worst of it, the silence. A sick person who didn't speak was a sick person who might not stay. You tried to help in the ways you knew. You soaked cloths in warm water and laid them on the forehead. You whispered prayers over bowls of broth. You held hands that grew colder, even beside the fire. And you waited, because sometimes That was all you could do. Children were especially vulnerable. Their bodies were small, their lungs not yet used to the smoke, the cold, the strain of winter. You wrapped them tighter, fed them from your own bowl, carried them in your arms when they couldn't walk. Sometimes they bounced back. Sometimes they didn't. You didn't cry loudly when one died. There was no energy for that, no space in the day. Grief came quietly, in the stillness after the body was wrapped, in the way the others avoided that bed for a while, in the sudden silence during evening prayers. Frostbite was a slower enemy. It crept in during long walks to the well, during chores done with bare fingers, during trips to the outhouse in the wind. You didn't always feel it at first. Just a tingling, then a burning, then nothing. That was when you knew it was serious. Fingers turned grey, then black. Toes swelled. Skin split open like dry bark. You rubbed the skin with snow, not because it helped, but because it was tradition. Because people said it woke the flesh. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. You tried not to let it happen. You wore your rags. You layered. You rubbed your limbs and stamped your feet. But the cold was patient. It didn't need a mistake. Just a moment of distraction. Infections were worse. A small cut on your hand could fester. A blister on your foot could become a wound that wouldn't close. You kept them clean as best you could. Boiled water ash, herbs mashed into paste. You did what your grandmother had done, what her grandmother had done. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes you watched as the skin turned red, then purple, then black, and you knew that limb was already partway gone. Teeth ached constantly. There were no dentists. No extractions unless you were brave or desperate. You learned to chew on one side, to drink your broth with your mouth half open, to grind herbs between your molars and hope the bitterness distracted from the pain. Ears froze, noses cracked, lips split until they bled, then bled until they scabbed, then scabbed until they split again. But you endured, because there was no other choice. When someone was sick enough to be bedridden, the house rearranged itself. Their mat was pulled closer to the fire. They were wrapped in all the blankets. Others moved around them in careful silence. Meals were brought in shifts. Hands were pressed to foreheads hourly. You marked time by breaths. How many in a minute? How shallow? How ragged? How still? You prayed not for a miracle, but for one more day. And when death came, it came gently. A stillness too perfect. A silence that didn't feel like sleep. A limpness that didn't shift when the fire cracked. You wrapped the body. You said the words. You opened the window, even in winter, to let the soul out. And then you went back to the fire. Not because it was over, but because it wasn't. Others still needed you. The house still needed tending. The cold still pressed at the door. And life, fragile, flickering, still needed protecting. So you carried on. Coughs still echoed. Wounds still festered. But so did kindness. And sometimes that was enough. Its sound was a presence, not loud, not insistent, but constant. The soft, irregular crack of wood splitting, the occasional hiss of trapped moisture, the low rustle of flame licking across bark. It was a kind of breathing, and in a world of ice and silence, that breathing meant life. The hearth wasn't in the center of the house by accident. It was the center of warmth, of memory, of everything. Your ears tuned to it the way you might listen for a heartbeat. When it was steady, you were calm. When it faltered, when the crackle turned into the sound of crumbling ash, you stirred from wherever you were, even in the depths of night, because letting it die wasn't an option. The sound changed depending on what you burned. Fresh wood hissed and snapped, not always pleasant, but familiar. Dried logs popped less, burned longer. Peat bricks gave a muffled crumble, releasing heat without much song. Dung burned quietest, a dull, steady smoulder that gave warmth without much drama. You didn't care about the music of the fire when your fingers were numb. You cared that it stayed alive, but still, the sound of well-burning wood was the best. It filled the space around you gently, a lullaby with no melody. It calmed children, soothed the elderly, gave company to those who sat alone. Even when the house was full, the fire's voice was the one that mattered most. You learned to read it. A fast crackling meant it needed tending. The flames danced too quickly, burning through fuel like a story told too fast. You added thicker logs, smoothed the flame's rhythm, slowed its breath. A dull, sluggish burn, you stirred it, let in air, pushed the coals to remind them they were not done. A hiss, moisture. You'd tossed in a damp branch, desperate, hoping it would dry before the fire gave up. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. The sound of the fire was a guide. When the wind screamed outside, and snow rattled against the shutters like fingers, the hearth told you what the house couldn't. You're safe. For now, it spoke to more than your ears. Its warmth radiated through the packed dirt floor, climbed the walls, kissed the low wooden beams. You could feel it on your cheeks, across the tops of your feet, on the back of your hands. You turned toward it instinctively, always. Like plants seeking the sun, the shadows it cast danced across your life, long fingers on the walls, flickering patterns that made even the barest home seem alive. Children stared into those shadows, told stories about the shapes. They saw wolves, heroes, monsters. Mothers smiled, listening, not because they believed, but because stories meant the fire was burning, and burning meant survival. Even when the fire was low, the sound lingered. A deep glow, the soft shift of ash as it collapsed inward. A final snap from a dying twig. You sat with it, often long after others had gone to bed, just watching, just listening. There was peace in it. Peace not because everything was fine, nothing was ever quite fine, but because something was holding the night at bay. Sometimes you spoke to it, not out loud, or not often, but thoughts drifted toward the fire like smoke. Worries, thanks, questions you couldn't ask anyone else. The fire didn't answer, but it didn't leave either, and that was something. People knew each other by how they tended the hearth. A careful keeper kept logs stacked neatly, stirred often, never let the flames touch the beams. A neglectful one let ash pile high, let the smoke thicken, let the fire choke on its own hunger. You judged no one in winter, but you noticed. Tending fire was a kind of character, and sharing it a kind of love. Guests were seated close, sick family closest, the young in the circle's heart. Those grieving were given the best stool, the softest blanket. No one said why. It was understood. The fire remembered everything. It had warmed births, cooked feasts, dried tears, lit the face of the dead one last time before burial. It didn't judge, it just kept burning, and when it died, accidentally, or because there was nothing left to burn, the house changed, not just in temperature, but in tone. Voices grew sharp, movements sluggish, the walls seemed closer, the shadows heavier. You rushed to relight it, hands trembling. Flint striking steel, sparks dancing, breath blowing, hope rising. The first flame always felt like a miracle, like watching light be born. And the first crackle after that soft, sharp promise of warmth was a kind of grace. Children stopped crying. Adults breathed deeper. Even the dog, curled in the corner, opened one eye. The fire was not just fuel, it was rhythm. It was home, and so you kept it fed, one stick at a time, one ember at a time, because as long as it spoke, you could sleep. And as long as it crackled, you were never alone. They didn't live with you, at least, that's what people liked to say. Animals belonged in the barn, the stable, the shed outside. That was the way of things. People hear beasts there, but in winter, the rules blurred. The cold didn't care about boundaries, and so, eventually, neither did you. It started with the chickens. Small, flustered creatures that were easy to bring in, easy to keep contained in a box or under a basket. They didn't smell too bad. They didn't take up too much space. And they gave you eggs, warm ones, if you were lucky. Sometimes you'd wake before dawn to the soft cluck beneath the bench, or a warm egg tucked in a nest of straw by the hearth. It felt like a gift. Then came the goats, harder to manage, stubborn, loud, especially when startled, but warm, unbelievably warm. Their bodies radiated heat like tiny furnaces. On the coldest nights, when the fire was low and the blankets thin, a goat curled against your side could be the difference between sleeping through the night and waking up half frozen. You didn't talk about it much. Letting animals in was a decision born of desperation, not affection. It wasn't about love, it was about heat and survival. Still, when the wind screamed through the shutters and the frost crept in along the floor, you felt a strange comfort in their breath, their slow chewing, the steady sound of life. Sometimes it was pigs. Not often, not unless things were really bad. Pigs were large, and they stank. But they were smart, and they didn't protest much when led inside. You gave them a corner, near the back, and laid straw thick enough to muffle the smell. Children sat near them for warmth. One boy in the village swore a pig had saved his life. He'd wrapped himself around it and slept like that all night. No one laughed, because everyone understood. Cows rarely came in. They were too big, too loud. But sometimes in storms, in the worst kind of snow, when a calf had just been born, you made room. You opened the door, moved the table, laid down hay, and gave them space. And in return, they gave you presents. A cow in the house changed everything. The air got warmer. The space grew smaller, but it felt safer. And the cow, quiet, heavy, thoughtful, stood like a totem of calm in the chaos. Its breath rose in warm clouds. Its eyes half-lidded with a kind of ancient patience. You didn't know what it was thinking, but you were grateful for it just being there. There were rules, of course. You didn't let animals roam. You kept them close to the door or near the wall. You laid straw to absorb the mess, and changed it often enough to keep sickness at bay. It wasn't pleasant, but neither was freezing. And if you had to choose between a clean floor and a warm house, you chose the warmth. Dogs had their own place. They were always allowed in, not because of the cold, but because of what they gave. Warning, protection, company. A dog curled up near the fire was as common as a pot or a stool. They were loyal, alert, and their warmth too was welcomed. They knew how to find the best spot. They lay across your feet, or under your arm, or against your side in sleep. Their fur smelled of smoke and outside and something you couldn't quite name. But they were good, they didn't judge. And in the night, when the wind howled, Their body pressed against yours was a reminder that you weren't alone. Cats were different. They came and went, stretched long by the fire, darted through shadows. They kept the mice in check. They didn't offer warmth so much as presence, soft, subtle, with a purr like a prayer. You didn't thank them. You didn't need to. They knew. You remembered stories, passed down by the old ones, of animals who spoke on Christmas Eve, of oxen who knelt at midnight, of cats who knew your name. You didn't believe, not really, but sometimes, in the quiet, you listened anyway, because winter made even the most practical person a little more willing to wonder. The animals didn't speak, but they stayed, and that was enough. Children bonded with them quickly. They gave them names, sang to them, whispered secrets, built tiny nests of straw around them, pressed their faces into warm flanks, dozed off to the rhythm of chewing or snuffling. No toy could compete with the feel of a soft ear against your cheek or the rise and fall of a breath bigger than your own. Sometimes you cried into their fur, softly, when no one was looking, not because they could fix anything, but because they were warm and quiet and didn't ask questions. They were not pets. They were part of the household. Like the fire, like the stew, like the silence. When spring came, they returned to the barn. The house was aired out, the straw burned or composted, the floor scrubbed with lye and ash. You swept and opened windows. But part of you missed them, their sounds, their smells, the comfort of their nearness. You didn't say it aloud, but you remembered. On cold nights in later years, when your house was sturdier, when your roof no longer leaked, when the fire burned hotter, you sometimes still thought about those nights, when warmth had a heartbeat, and salvation had hooves. There was no sudden shift, no thunderclap, no sign in the sky, just a slow, dwindling daylight, shrinking inch by inch, until it felt like you barely saw the sun at all. One day, you noticed it was gone before you'd finished your chores. The next, it was dark even before supper. And then, suddenly, it was the solstice. You didn't need a calendar to know. Your body told you. Your bones knew. The air felt different, heavier, older. There was something in the silence that reminded you how close you lived to the edge of the world. The solstice wasn't a festival in the way the summer ones were. It was quieter, more intimate, less a celebration than a breath held, a promise whispered in the dark. The villagers marked it, each in their own way, some with prayer, some with food, some with silence. There was no single ritual, but everyone knew what the day meant. The worst was not yet over, but from here on, the light would return. That was enough. In your home, the fire was fed with the best wood you had left dry, clean, saved for just this purpose. It wasn't about light or even heat. It was about hope. You wanted the fire to burn steady through the longest night, to greet the dawn without faltering. You sat near it longer than usual, your family close, the space between bodies smaller, the silences deeper. You didn't speak of the cold. You didn't speak of fear. You just existed together, in a circle of light that pushed against the dark. Someone might hum an old melody, more breath than tune, a song from a time before memory. No one joined in. No one needed to. It was enough to have sound, soft human sound, rise above the crackling of logs. Children were told stories on solstice night, not loud tales, not ones with dragons or knights, but stories about warmth, the first fire ever made, the animals that brought heat into the world, The ancestors who watched the sun return each year with eyes wide from wonder. You didn't know if they were true, but truth wasn't the point. The point was that someone had lived through darker nights before. That you were not the first to wait for morning with everything you had. You lit a candle, if you had one, or maybe just set a coal in a clay dish, glowing in the dark. You watched it like it was alive, because in a way it was. It breathed, it warmed. It reminded you that something still burned inside, even when the world outside was frozen and still. Food was shared more freely on solstice, even when stores were low. A small wheel of cheese, a bit of honey, a piece of dried fruit. You didn't gorge, you honored. You tasted sweetness like it was summer itself, hidden in your mouth. And you gave thanks, not loudly, not with fanfare, but with the quiet reverence of someone who had earned this light. Outside, the sky was thick with stars. You stepped out briefly, wrapped in everything you owned, breath clouding in front of your face. You looked up and saw the same sky your ancestors had watched, and for a moment the cold didn't matter. You were part of something vast, and still and slowly turning back toward the sun. Inside, the warmth waited. The house smelled of smoke and bread, the walls flickered gold, and in the corners, where the firelight didn't reach, the shadows watched without menace. They knew, as you did, that their time was not eternal. In some homes, small symbols were drawn near the door, chalk lines, circles, runes of protection or luck. Not because you believed in magic, necessarily, but because belief itself was a kind of warmth, a ritual of resistance, a way to shape meaning out of long nights. You went to bed with your back to the fire, still dressed, still wrapped, still pressed against others. You didn't expect sleep to come easily. The solstice had a strange energy, restless and slow, like the world was holding its breath, but you felt not safe, exactly, just known, as if the night itself saw you and acknowledged your waiting. When morning came late, dim grey, you greeted it like an old friend returned from a long journey, not with cheers, not with songs, just by rising, slowly, and opening the door. The cold hit your face, like always, but something had shifted. It wasn't warmer, but it would be, and that was everything. You marked the day in your mind. This was when it began to turn. This was the moment the sun started coming back to you, hour by hour, minute by minute. The solstice passed like a whisper, but you remembered it all winter, when the wind howled, when the frost bit, when hope grew thin. You remembered the longest night, and how you had met it with fire and silence, and the quiet certainty that the light would find you again. It settled in your bones, lingered in the corners of the room, drifted between people like mist. You could go whole hours without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because the cold made words feel heavier, less necessary, more expensive. You weren't alone, not really, but there were days when it felt that way, when the house was full and still, when the fire was steady but low, when others were nearby but tucked into their own tasks or thoughts. The sound of a spoon scraping a bowl, the hush of breath, the soft clunk of logs being rearranged. These became your companions, and it was enough. Sometimes solitude wasn't just about being by yourself. It was about how winter carved space around you, inside you, made your thoughts louder, your memories sharper, your longing deeper. The days stretched, dim and repetitive. The sky was often the same shade of grey for weeks. The trees stood like dark statues, unmoving, skeletal. Inside, the walls seemed closer. Your corner of the house became your entire world. A stool, a patch of floor near the fire, a worn spot on the table where your elbow always rested. You watched the light change across that spot. You watched the steam rise from your cup. You watched your own hands, cracked and red, and wondered how they still moved. There was comfort in routine. You chopped kindling. You stirred the pot. You mended socks. You fed the animals. You pulled water from the well. You wrapped your scarf 3 times around your neck. Each task repeated itself like a prayer. Not sacred, not ceremonial, just necessary. But even prayer can become lonely. Some days, the silence felt like a weight. You missed summer laughter. The sound of carts on dry roads, birds. The murmur of neighbors talking in the field. Even the creak of the market stall in the wind. The world in winter was muffled, like someone had laid a thick cloth over it. And yet the cold also pulled people close. Togetherness wasn't loud either. It was subtle. It was in the way someone passed you a log without being asked. The way a child leaned against your leg without a word. The way your partner pressed their back to yours at night and didn't pull away. You didn't have long, deep conversations in winter. You didn't sit around sharing dreams and fears. You shared silence. You shared space. You shared the fire. That was intimacy. One pot fed everyone. One blanket covered many. One fire warmed the whole room. You learned to time your movements with others, to make space, to shift, to share. You knew when someone needed the seat nearest the flames. You moved without needing to be told. The cold taught you to listen, to watch, to sense the small shifts in others. A wince, a sigh, a hand clenching in a blanket. These were your language. These were the ways you said, I see you. I know you're hurting. I'm here. It was a quiet kind of love. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that stays. Sometimes loneliness came even when you were together. You could feel it settle on someone like snow, slowly, gently, until they barely moved. Their eyes dulled. Their hands hesitated. They sat near the fire but didn't feel its warmth. You recognized it because you felt it too. You didn't try to cheer them. You didn't speak in platitudes. You sat beside them, pressed your shoulder to theirs, passed them a hot cup, wrapped a bit more wool around their back. You didn't fix it, but you didn't let them vanish into it either. In that way, winter taught patience. It showed you how to wait for someone's spirit to return, how to stand guard without being noticed, how to offer presence, not solutions. There were rare days when laughter happened, a joke whispered in the dark, a child slipping on ice and bursting into giggles, someone humming a tune from a warmer month. These moments glowed brighter because they were rare, not forced, not expected, just tiny eruptions of life in the long hush of the season. You held on to them tightly. Togetherness could feel crowded. The house was small, the air thick. Every cough, every sneeze, every shift on the straw bed was shared. There were days when you wanted space more than warmth, days when you longed for a walk alone, just to feel your own mind clearly. But going outside meant facing the wind, the stillness, the silence that didn't care about you. So you stayed, and learned to find solitude inside the crowd. You stared into the fire and let your thoughts wander. You folded cloth slowly. You pressed your forehead to the cool wall and breathed. You weren't running away. You were making room for yourself. Because winter didn't just test your body, it tested your spirit. And the spirit, like the fire, needed tending. At night, when everyone was finally still, you felt the weight of shared breath around you. The house exhaled in unison, Sleep was thick and tangled. The dreams came slowly, half frozen, half formed, but you dreamed of warmth, of sun on your face, of laughter that didn't need fire to survive. And sometimes in the quiet, in the closeness, in the cold, you felt it already returning, not loudly, just enough. It wasn't supposed to be. Softness was a luxury for warmer seasons and wealthier lives. Your bed was a frame of rough wood, sometimes just a platform raised above the dirt floor. Straw was your mattress, brittle, itchy, pressed thin from months of use. Over time, it flattened to a mat no thicker than a woven rug. It smelled of dust, sweat, and old seasons. But it was your place, your square of stillness, your pause in the day's endless movement. You didn't undress to sleep, not in winter. You kept everything on, wool over linen, undercloth, under tunic, sometimes even your boots, especially if the floor near your bed froze solid. Taking anything off meant exposing skin to cold that seemed to crawl through even the smallest opening. And still, the cold found you. It curled around your ankles, whispered through the seams in the wall, slipped between your layers like fingers seeking a pulse. You curled tighter, knees to chest, chin to collarbone. You shared the bed, of course. No one slept alone unless they had no other choice. Together, you built heat. Together, you chased sleep. But it came slow. The cold sharpened your awareness. Every tiny pain magnified, a scratch, a sore toe, a cough. You listened to the house groan, to the wind scratch across the roof, to the animals shifting in their corner. You waited for your body to go numb in the right ways, just enough to stop noticing the discomfort. Not so much that you worried about frostbite. Sometimes dreams took you early. They weren't always kind. The cold slipped into your subconscious, too. You dreamed of snow that swallowed your house, of rivers frozen solid, never to thaw, of walking, always walking, without feeling your feet. Other nights, you dreamed of fire, of a hearth burning so hot it made your skin itch, of warm bread, warm hands, warm air. You woke up hungry for it, aching in your chest for something you'd never really had. Not like that, not in that abundance. The hardest nights were the ones when the fire died. You always tried to keep it going. A few coals, carefully banked, usually survived till morning. But sometimes it faltered. The wind slipped in and sucked the heat away. The embers turned to ash faster than you expected. No one had woken to feed it. You felt it immediately. The cold moved in like a wave, sinking into everything. The blanket went stiff. The straw felt like stone. The air hurt to breathe. You tried not to move, knowing every shift let in more chill. But you couldn't stop your shivering. It shook your ribs, made your teeth clack. You pressed against your sleeping companions, desperate for their heat, for any sign they felt it too. Sometimes they did, sometimes not. A child whimpered, an elder sighed in their sleep. You held your breath and listened, waiting for signs of life. You told yourself morning wasn't far. You told yourself you'd survive this one, too. Some didn't. You woke to silence thicker than usual, to a body to still, to the hush that settled when death arrived quietly, without announcement. There was no scream, no drama, just an absence. You didn't speak. You just lay there, unmoving, until someone else rose and began the day. Other times, it was your own body that betrayed you. Your legs cramped from being curled too tight. Your arms fell asleep under your weight. Your face froze against the wall. You woke with skin stiff as paper, with limbs that didn't respond immediately. You learned not to panic. You breathed. You flexed your fingers slowly. You whispered into the dark, just to hear your own voice. Not words, sound, something alive. When the fire was strong, the bed was almost pleasant. You warmed a stone near the hearth, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it beneath the blanket. You shared whispered words, simple ones, warmer tonight. You awake, almost spring. You heard the fire pop and hiss, and it lulled you, a lullaby made of survival. Even then, the dreams were strange. Winter dreams weren't about stories. They were feelings, colors, moments. The flicker of candlelight, a hand in yours, the smell of time, the cry of a bird you hadn't heard in months. They came and went like breath. Some believed the long sleep of winter opened a door to other worlds, that in your dreams you walked between the living and the dead, that your soul wandered beyond the frost, met others, learned truths. You didn't always believe, but sometimes you woke with the weight of something you couldn't name. And you carried it through the day. Sleep in winter was survival, not rest, not luxury, just enough stillness to allow your body to try again. You never woke refreshed. You woke stiff, sore, cold, but awake, and that was enough. Sometimes, when you couldn't sleep, you recited names, your family, your neighbors, the saints, the seasons, a litany of presents, a reminder that the world still held people, that you were not alone in this night. You imagined summer, not as it was, but as you needed it to be. Green fields, bare feet, warm wind. You pictured yourself lying in tall grass, staring up at clouds, your skin hot with sun. It felt like remembering someone else's life, but it helped. It helped you fall asleep eventually. And when you woke, face pressed to rough cloth, body wrapped in layers, breath clouding the air, you knew you'd done it. Another night, another dream, another dawn. The cold would still be there, but so would you. Morning didn't come all at once. In winter, it approached shyly, a hint of grey behind the shutters, a softening of the shadows. No golden flood of sunlight, no sudden blaze, just a gradual lifting of darkness, as though the sky was remembering how to breathe again. And yet, every morning, it felt like a miracle. You stirred before the light touched the walls, not because you were rested. No one in winter ever truly was, but because the cold demanded it, because the fire needed tending, because someone had to check the animals, break the ice in the water trough, sweep away last night's snow from the threshold. You opened your eyes to a world still cloaked in frost. Your breath rose in thin clouds. Your joints ached. Your fingers fumbled with cloth and wood and kindling. But you rose. That was the triumph. Rising, the moment you opened the door, the cold rushed in like a memory. It hit your face, slipped down your collar, bit into your chest like a challenge. But you knew it well by now. It was an old adversary, one who would test you, but who had already failed to defeat you through the night. Outside, the world was still quiet. The snow glowed faintly, taking on the color of the sky, lavender, silver, ash blue. Trees stood stiff and unmoving. Smoke rose straight from chimneys, thin and slow. And on the horizon, just beyond the far line of hills or trees or rooftops, you saw it. Light, not warmth, not yet, but the first glimmer of day. The sun hadn't shown its face, but its hand had touched the edge of the world. You watched it for a moment, breathing in air so cold it hurt, but it also woke something inside you. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter, something steadier. A pulse of knowing I made it through. I will make it again. You returned inside with that light still in your eyes. The fire, if you were lucky, still held embers. You stirred them gently, coaxed flame from the ashes, fed it a few sticks, and waited. The house changed with the fire's return. Shadows retreated. Color returned to faces. The day began. Others rose slowly, each wrapped in their own silence. They shuffled to the fire, held out stiff hands, mumbled greetings. No one said much. The words came later, after the tea, after the warm bowl, after the first wave of warmth had settled into the room. But in those early moments, the light grew. Outside, it slipped across the snow, painted the windows with dull gold. It touched the rafters, glinted off the pots, bounced off the edge of the hearth. You didn't worship the sun, but you respected it. And in winter, it felt personal. It had returned. It had chosen to rise again. Even if the sky stayed grey, even if the wind blew harder later, even if another storm loomed. This light, this fragile, quiet light, was yours. You marked the passage of time by how far it reached. In early winter, it barely scraped across the floor. By late winter, it climbed the walls. You watched it move each day a few inches higher, a few moments longer, a measure of survival, a countdown to the thaw. Sometimes you stood in it, just a small patch, just for a second. You let it fall across your hands, your cheeks. You closed your eyes and imagined it warmer than it really was. You pretended it could fill you. Sometimes it almost did. Children noticed it first. They called it out. It's brighter today. The sky's blue. Look, no clouds. They didn't care about the calendar. They knew the light. They believed in it. Their joy was contagious. You smiled more easily. You laughed at their excitement. You caught yourself humming, not because life was easy, but because the sun was real, and you were still here to see it. The animals responded. They moved more, ate better, stretched their limbs. You watched them turn their faces toward the door, toward the snow, toward the light. As if even they knew, this is not forever. You changed with the morning. Your shoulders relaxed. Your steps grew lighter. The burden of night slipped off slowly, replaced by tasks, simple, repetitive, necessary. But with daylight, those tasks felt manageable. You hauled water. You chopped wood. You swept the floor. You brushed snow from the eaves. And all the while, the sun moved higher, even if just slightly, even if hidden behind clouds, even if it gave no heat. It moved, and that movement was a kind of promise. You remembered darker mornings, the ones that felt endless, the ones where the fire wouldn't catch, the ones when someone didn't wake up, and you honored them quietly, by keeping the fire alive, by feeding the animals, by stepping out into the cold and turning your face always toward the light. Because you understood something now. The sun doesn't return because we deserve it. It returns because that is its nature. And so we wait, and endure, and rise, again and again, even on the coldest mornings, especially on those the sun didn't warm your skin that morning, but it lit your world. And sometimes light is the first kind of warmth, the most important kind, the one that leads all the others. It was taught to you slowly, steadily, not in lessons, but in looks, in gestures, in quiet acts of repetition. The knowledge passed from hands rough with age to hands still soft with youth, from eyes that had seen many snows to those just beginning to understand what frost truly meant. There were no books, no scrolls, no diagrams, only experience, and memory, and the stories that lived in breath and firelight. Your mother never said, "This is how we survive." She just moved through winter like she'd done it 1,000 times, because she had. You watched the way she stacked kindling, layered clothes, stirred the pot in just the right rhythm so nothing burned even when her mind wandered elsewhere. She could tell the weather by the smell of the air, the weight of the clouds, the way the animals stood still. She never called it a gift, just common sense, but to you it was magic. Your father was quieter. He didn't explain why the fire had to be banked a certain way, why the window had to be cracked open just a little. Even in the coldest weeks, he simply did it. And when you forgot, he didn't scold. He let the smoke fill the room until your eyes stung, and then he nodded when you fixed it. Now you'll remember, and you did. Your grandparents taught you in even fewer words. Your grandfather's stories were short, a sentence, sometimes two. We once went 3 days without a fire. There was a time the snow buried the barn. Your uncle lost 2 fingers before we found him. They never ended with a moral, just with silence. You filled in the lesson yourself. Your grandmother showed you how to wrap your feet in cloth before the boots, how to save the broth's fat and rub it on your hands when they cracked, how to place a coal in a clay bowl under the bed, just enough to take the edge off the cold without starting a fire in your sleep. And every year these rituals deepened, became instinct, until one day you found yourself doing them without thinking, pressing the bread crust into the stew to soak every drop, saving the driest wood for the longest night, checking the roof before the storm arrived. You didn't become strong all at once. The cold shaped you. Each season etched a little more patience into your skin, a little more endurance into your spine. You stopped complaining about the small things, wet socks, dull knives, icy wind through the shutter. You learned to fix, to mend, to wait. You understood what could be changed and what had to be endured. You began passing on these things without realizing it. You caught a child reaching toward a hot pot and said, "No, not like that." You helped a neighbor with her firewood and told her to stack it crosswise so it dries faster. See? You found yourself humming the same winter lullaby your mother had hummed to you, not knowing all the words, but knowing the tune was enough. The wisdom didn't live in words, it lived in rhythm, in knowing when to gather, when to rest, when to risk, and when to wait. It lived in scars, the small burns on your fingers from grabbing a pot too fast, the faded line on your shin from a misjudged axe swing, each mark a memory, a reminder. Some winters were easier. You almost forgot how hard it could be, but then a harsh one would come, and all that knowledge, the old hard knowledge, rose again like muscle memory. Your hands moved before your thoughts. Your eyes scanned the clouds like they were reading a book, and the younger ones turned to you. They asked what to do, and you told them, gently, without pride, because the strength wasn't yours alone. It had been carried to you by many hands. It had walked many miles, slept in many cold rooms, held many crying children, lost many things, and still gone on. You weren't just surviving your winter, you were honoring theirs. Sometimes you wondered how far back the wisdom reached. Who first thought to build the hearth in the center? Who first wrapped wool with straw for insulation? Who first realized that sleeping beside an animal could save your life? Their names were forgotten, but their choices lived on in yours. You could feel them in the way you stood in the wind, shoulders forward, eyes half closed, waiting it out. In the way you listened to the fire, not just watched it. In the way you gave without being asked, a bowl, a blanket, a place near the flame. Because winter didn't allow for selfishness. It punished vanity, it respected humility, and it rewarded those who remembered. Not dates, not titles, but tasks, skills, kindnesses. And now you were the memory keeper, the one who knew how deep the snow had once gotten, how long a person could go without warmth, how precious it was to have dry boots. You taught the next ones with your hands, your silence, your steady repetition. You let them make mistakes, small ones, and you helped them fix them, because survival was not perfection, it was persistence, and persistence is best learned by doing. So you did, again and again, season after season, carrying the fire forward. At least, that's what it seems like. Heaters humming quietly behind walls, lights flickering on with the flick of a switch, windows that don't rattle in the wind. Winter arrives, but not like before. Not as a threat, but as a season of sweaters, of flavored drinks, of photographs taken in the snow. And yet, if you listen closely, you'll hear the old winter's whisper in the steam that rises from your cup on a cold morning, in the way you still tug your blanket tighter around your shoulders, even indoors, in the way a certain wind, sharp and sudden, makes you pause at the door before stepping out. The past didn't vanish, it folded itself into you. The endurance of your ancestors, the peasants who braved nights with no heat, no light, and no guarantee of spring, lives quietly in your winter habits. You may not gather firewood in the forest, but you still feel that tug of preparation when the days grow shorter. You clean, you stock up, you wrap things tightly. That instinct is old, it's inherited. It's survival turned ritual. Take the act of lighting a candle. Today, it's ambience, mood, a soft glow for calm evenings. But once, it was a declaration. I will not let the dark win. Every flame on your table is an echo of 1,000 fires tended in silence, with frost at the door. The foods you call comfort, thick stews, warm bread, slow-cooked meats, are born of scarcity, born of the need to stretch every ingredient to make the fire do more than just warm the room. Each spoonful carries centuries of adaptation, of trial and error, of families learning how to turn hunger into sustenance. Even the way you gather changes in winter. In warmer months, there's movement, dispersal. But when the cold creeps in, people draw together around tables, in living rooms, in shared spaces where warmth collects. It mirrors the old way, around a hearth, around the one fire, bodies pressed close, not out of affection alone, but necessity. You may have space now, but part of you remembers when space was dangerous, when distance meant isolation, and isolation meant cold. That's why holidays feel heavier in winter, not because of decorations or gifts, but because gathering feels instinctive, as if some old part of you knows that being together is still the safest thing. The stories you tell, the songs you hum, even the silence you share with others on cold nights, all of them are heirlooms. You don't need to know their origin to feel their weight. They were carried through storms, through darkness, through the brittle air of long Decembers. And now they live with you. Look at the way you check the sky when snow is forecast. Not just for curiosity, but as if measuring it. Look at how you tuck your hands into your sleeves, how you choose to stand with your back to the wind, how you place your boots near the door. These gestures are ancient. You were never taught them explicitly. You remembered them, because remembering is a kind of inheritance. You may sleep under thick blankets, in insulated rooms, with thermostats humming quietly. but something in you still listens for the fire, still tracks the sun's arc across the shortest days, still finds peace in a bowl of hot soup after coming in from the cold. You may not share your room with goats or pigs anymore, but you keep pets closer in winter, drawn to their warmth, their soft breaths, their ancient role in your shelter. And when the power goes out, when the heater breaks, when the storm knocks on the windows louder than expected, you remember, the candles come out, the layers go on. You find yourself stirring soup longer, checking the doors twice, listening for cracks in the silence. And somewhere in the back of your mind, an old voice whispers, "You've done this before." Maybe not you, exactly, but someone in your blood. Someone who sat where you sit, wrapped in wool and hope, waiting for the sun to return. That's the strange thing about winter. It connects you not just to those around you, but to those long gone, to the villagers with no names, the children who shivered beside sleeping dogs, the elders who whispered to flames, the mothers who counted potatoes and prayers with the same breath. They live in your habits, your cravings, your comforts. Every time you light a fire, every time you wrap a scarf, every time you close your eyes and listen to the snow fall. Winter is not just a season. It's a memory, it's a lineage. It's a story you continue, even without knowing the first lines. You don't need to suffer to understand. You only need to pause, to feel the chill in the air, to notice the way your breath curls upward in the morning, and to remember that once someone just like you stood at a frosted window and watched the same sun rise through the same winter sky, and they made it, just like you will. You made it through another night. Not just the literal ones, the frost-bitten, fire-fed, blanket-heavy nights, but the long stretch of this story, too. The walk backward through memory, through lives once lived in cold silence and smoky breath. And now, as this final section begins, maybe your body is still, your eyes soft, your breath slow. That's good, because this last part isn't about history anymore. It's about you. You've heard their voices now, the peasants and mothers, the coughing children, the quiet old men, the goats and dogs and flickering fires. You've felt their frost, sat in their straw beds, stirred their stew. Maybe, in some quiet corner of your imagination, you became them for a while, and now it's time to carry them with you. The cold, after all, is a mirror. It shows you what matters. It strips the world down to what is truly needed: warmth, shelter, silence, presence. Not performance, not achievement, just being, just staying alive, together, long enough to see the light return. In their world, survival was quiet. It wasn't celebrated with loud voices or trumpets. It was marked in soft exhales, in meals shared, in moments where the fire didn't go out. You do this too, when your day ends and the lights dim, when you close your eyes and listen to a voice, maybe mine, tell a story from long ago. When you settle under your own blankets and feel the comfort of safety, of shelter, of time past. That's your version of the hearth. And maybe tonight you'll feel something else too. Not sorrow, not pity for those who lived before, but a strange, unexpected comfort, because their endurance makes yours feel less lonely. Their hardship makes your quiet struggles feel seen. And their rituals, the fire tending, the food sharing, the body huddling, those are your rituals too. Even if you live in a warmer world, a brighter one, their lives echo in yours. And that echo brings a kind of peace. Tonight, as the cold wraps itself around your city, or town, or countryside, whether you feel it in your skin or just remember it in your bones, Let yourself pause. Imagine the sound of a fire, the scent of wood smoke, the way a woolen blanket feels against your cheek. Imagine you're sitting at the edge of a medieval bed, someone you love breathing slow beside you, the wind scratching softly at the door. And know, truly know that this moment, this quiet breath, this stillness, it's the same warmth they carried, the same hope, the same waiting for light. We are not so far from them, you and I, and perhaps, on cold nights like this, history is not something behind us, it's around us, inside us, a shared breath, a shared silence. A story that doesn't end, but waits patiently at the edge of sleep. So rest now, let your body sink, let your thoughts slow, let the old world fade into a soft haze of straw beds and starlit snow and firelight flickering on stone walls. They've walked with you long enough. Now it's time to close your eyes. You're safe, you're warm, and you're not alone. Not really.